Hey, let's do this. What are we going to talk about today? Today is obviously July 4th, 2026. It is the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, which, as we all know, dates July 4th, 1776. So 250 years, a quarter millennium. It is a big milestone in the historical trajectory of our country. And I mean, I'm one of those individuals who would say that if we want to understand where we are and where we're going, we have to understand where we came from. Now, I am a person who is quite critical of the American government. But again, as I have said many times, and as I still maintain, there is a critical distinction between the government and the country. And I am someone who loves my country. I consider myself to be a patriotic American. So I feel that I can criticize the government and even criticize some of the things in the history of our country that are just some of the more unsavory aspects of what our country has been involved in, generally because of decisions that were made by the government. But I believe that I can do all of that while still being patriotic and while still being someone who loves his country, which I do. I'm a very proud American. Anyone who's followed me for any time whatsoever knows that I served a long time in the military. I mean, yeah, proud American here. So let's talk about the Declaration of Independence. And in doing so, we're going to try to we're going to situate the Declaration in its time and place. And in doing that, we're also going to look at some of the historical precedents that led to the Declaration of Independence and see what was going on in the minds of some of these colonists when the Declaration of Independence was created. Okay, so I just said, that I grew up as a patriotic American. So I grew up in North Carolina, which is one of the original 13 colonies, then 13 states. The mascot for the elementary school that I went to was the Patriots. I grew up in a very patriotic household. I decided to go to school at the military academy. So I've been a patriot all my life. And many of you might say the same thing. So, what does that mean when we look back on the Declaration of Independence? Because I'm going to say something real quick about history. Unfortunately, I don't think that most Americans understand history. And this is hugely problematic. But it's not even that they don't understand some of the more secretive or hidden elements to history, of which there are many. It's that they're not even familiar with the normie mainstream narrative view of history. So if you don't even understand kind of the normie narrative of history, then how are you going to understand where that narrative is wrong or misguided or incomplete? So you almost kind of have to understand the normie narrative to then even understand where that might lead you astray if it's all you understand of history. The problem is most Americans don't even understand that. So most of what we're going to kind of go into tonight is kind of the more normal mainstream ideas of the Declaration of Independence, because some of these are not even necessarily well known. I do plan to do a longer, broader video on the founding and maybe try to make sense of some of these elements of our founding that are sometimes in tension. For example, there are ongoing debates about whether or not America is a Christian nation or a deist nation. What was the role of Freemasonry? I think to some degree, I think that there's this syncretic America that we must contend with. That kind of America is a blend. It is even, perhaps paradoxically, a land of contradiction. I think we just have to be comfortable understanding that. Now, do I believe that America is a Christian nation? Yeah, I do. I think many of the early Americans were undoubtedly Christian. I think some of the leaders that were not, and I do believe that there were some machinations in the shadows, that probably had some ulterior motives in their heads when it came to kind of framing our nation as it exists today. And the reason I say all that, and I'll go into this in much greater detail in another video, is because when we look at the problems that America has today, do these problems persist? So do they exist and persist in spite of our beginnings, or because of our beginnings? In other words, were they kind of baked into the cake? And I think that's a great question. Those are things that we should feel comfortable grappling with. But I do think there's a lot of greatness in our history. I do think there's some problems as well, but it's okay to celebrate the greatness. It's okay to eat hot dogs and go to the beach, or fireworks, grill hamburgers, whatever it is that you do on July 4th. It's okay to do those things, but you should at least have some sort of historical understanding of what the day represents. Okay, so what is America? Is it just an idea? Is it a country kind of founded just on this proposition? Is that all it is, or is it more than that? I have talked about, and I've written about and I've spoken about before, this idea of performing some sort of audit of our legal and political systems, like basically going through and looking through our own history, assessing our legal systems, our political systems, and then kind of examining the philosophical foundations and then kind of the theological foundations that underpin those philosophical foundations. I've talked about that. Or understanding, okay, what are the political philosophies that kind of led to the way in which we developed our systems? And then if you go back one step further, what are the theological assumptions or the theological foundations that political philosophy or philosophies were built upon? Because I think a lot of that has been kind of lost to history, and it's not very well understood. And I'll tell you another thing. If we kind of take a deeper look at our history, I think there are things that we would understand about where we are today and how we got here, and perhaps how to move forward from here in the most valuable way. Okay. All right. So July 4th, 1776. How do we get there? We're going to talk about that a little bit, but here's an interesting note. So there was a letter that John Adams wrote to his wife in which he actually said that he thought July 2nd would be the day that would be remembered throughout history as Independence Day. And the reason is because that was the day in which the Continental Congress voted to approve a resolution that had been written by Richard Henry Lee. Now, Richard Henry Lee was a statesman of Virginia, and in this resolution that he submitted, it said the following: these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. Now, that's pretty strong language. So that language comes from a resolution from Richard Henry Lee of Virginia, and the Continental Congress voted to approve that resolution on July 2nd, 1776. This led John Adams to believe that that would be the day that would be remembered throughout American history. Well, what actually happened 2 days later on July 4th is that the actual language of the Declaration of Independence was approved, and thus we actually remember July 4th. Now, who is Richard Henry Lee? The guy who submitted this resolution that was voted on July 2nd. So he was a statesman from Virginia, from the large and prominent Lee family. This is the same Lee family of Robert E. Lee. Richard Henry Lee was the first cousin of Henry Lee II. You can see where this gets confusing. Richard Henry Lee, Henry Lee II. Henry Lee II would have a son named Henry Lee III, also known as Light Horse Harry. And Henry Lee III would have a son named Robert E. Lee of, the Confederate Army, the Army of Northern Virginia. So So Richard Henry Lee is first cousins with Henry Lee II, who is the grandfather of Robert E. Lee. So yes, all part of the same Lee family. Okay, let's see. What else should we talk about today as we're talking about kind of how we got to July 4th, 1776? Let me just say something else that many of you are going to hear this and you're going to say, are you serious? But yeah, I'm serious. This has to be said because a lot of people, they don't know this. Okay. The Declaration of Independence is separate from the Constitution. Okay. They are two documents. They were written and approved more than a decade apart. It is extremely frustrating when I hear people talk in a way that lets me know that they are either confusing the two or that they don't actually know that they are two separate documents. People have, a lot of Americans, they have no idea as to kind of the timing of the founding period. Okay. We're going to talk a little bit about that today, but just with a very broad brush, let me tell you, in 1775, the war starts, specifically April 19th, Lexington and Concord, the shot heard around the world, right? Okay. More than a year later, on July 4th, 1776, that's the Declaration of Independence that is approved. Okay. Okay, the Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1776. Everybody knows that date, but that is more than a year after the War for Independence has begun. Okay, the war concludes. The war is fought, and what's the governmental architecture for the war? Well, you have a Continental Congress. Then later you have the approval of the Articles of Confederation, which were our first Constitution. Okay, the war ends. Okay, and then several years later, you have the Philadelphia Convention in the summer of 1787, in which actually the delegates that were there at the Philadelphia Convention were there to draft amendments to the Articles of Confederation. They ended up drafting a new constitution. That new constitution was approved in September of 1787, had to go to the states for ratification. It would become fully ratified upon the ninth state ratifying it. The ninth state ratified it in June of 1788. So, and it became, in effect. And then in 1789 is when it was fully put into practice, and that's when George Washington was inaugurated, et cetera. So early 1789. But there's a lot of time in between the Declaration of Independence of 1776 and the Constitution that is drafted in 1787, ratified in 1788, and kind of goes into full effect with a new governmental structure in 1789. That's a lot of time in between there. So again, when you hear people talk about how our Constitution kind of invokes this right to abolish or alter the government, no, that is language from the Declaration. And if you think about it, it makes sense that that would be in the Declaration. It makes no sense that that would be in the Constitution. The Constitution is us framing our own government after we've already won independence. The Declaration is what talks about us separating from Britain. But I hear people quite regularly invoke this language from the Declaration and attribute it to the Constitution. If you hear people do that, please understand they do not know what they're talking about. Okay. Don't listen to people like that, because it's like, if you don't understand the distinction between these two documents and the purpose of each, then I'm sorry, but your opinion on whatever it is that you're talking about is probably not going to curry a lot of influence with me. Okay. So the Declaration of Independence must be understood in its time and place. I said that a few minutes ago. However, there are historical precedents that we should understand, and history only runs in one direction. So this is the other danger. A lot of people put on their recency glasses and they read the Declaration of Independence and they read in all of these presently accepted ideas into a very old document. Okay, that's not the way to understand the Declaration of Independence. It's not really the way to understand the Constitution or letters that were written from that time period or anything like that. Okay, time moves in one direction. So that means that things that happened before that, yes, may have influenced it. Okay. It is acceptable to read it in that way. But us reading it and trying to take the way in which we view things and then kind of superimpose them on texts that were written centuries ago, that doesn't work. Okay. Now, here's another interesting note. The revolution, was it a revolution? I think that's a fascinating question. Generally speaking, you will hear me refer to the war as the war for independence. Now, what does revolution mean? Generally, when we think of revolution in a political sense, then we think of, well, there is a new government in place. In that sense, in that kind of narrow way of looking at the term revolution, well, was what happened in the 1780s and early 1780s a revolution in the colonies? Well, I guess it kind of depends on how you look at it. Within the colonies and then states, yes, there was a new government in place, but George Washington never had in mind that he was going to, sit on the throne in London and become King George IV. That was never in his mind. It was more about self-government for the American state. And that's kind of I think it's important for us to remember that. So does that mean that the term revolution does or does not apply? I'm not sure. I guess it depends on how you use it. But I tend to refer to the war as the war for independence because to me, it's like, well, revolution, at least in that sense, is a little bit of a stretch because nobody was talking about overthrowing the government in London, like the actual British government. Now, the counter to that is what they were talking about, replacing the governmental structure, the British governmental structure as it existed in the States. Because remember, you had royal governors. So the governor of the colonies, these governors had been appointed by the king. So there was a royal, architecture that did exist in the States. That's true. Of course, that was, abolished. So in that regard, is it a revolution? I don't know. But I think it is important for us to kind of tease out those ideas and understand, well, in what ways was it or was it not a revolution? Maybe you have a slightly different opinion on where you want to draw that line as to whether it was or whether it wasn't, and that's fine. But if we take the word revolution and we apply it in a broader context than just like its political sense. So, think of the way in which you, other ways in which you might use the term, like the Industrial Revolution. Well, that's not a political revolution per se. So why do we call it a revolution? In what way, metaphorically speaking, was that a revolution? So in that regard, does it apply? Well, maybe it does. But this kind of takes us to another idea. And this is something that has been debated for a long time. Was this whole, the Declaration of Independence, the war, the revolution, so to speak, and I don't really have a huge problem with calling it a revolution, but I don't really like I prefer war for independence over revolutionary war. I'm not saying revolutionary war is wrong. I'm just telling you what I prefer. But was the revolution, and I do use that term, even if I don't necessarily use it a lot to apply to the war, but I will use the term revolution to apply to this time period. So was the revolution, was it radical in nature or was it conservative? Were the colonists trying to conserve certain ideas and rights that they felt were being trampled upon, or were what they were suggesting totally radical? Because if it was totally radical, then the term revolution might more aptly apply. I'm one of those who, if we approach history through the normally accepted view, I'm one of those who thinks that it was more conservative and kind of less radical. There are plenty of people who would disagree with that. But if it was more conservative and less radical, then it might also be looked at as less revolutionary. That said, let me give a quick caveat to what I just said. If you look at some of the more hidden aspects of this time period, which I think are definitely there, we're not going to get too deep into that tonight. then I think some of that was quite revolutionary. So anyway, that's a lot to throw at you. Just some ideas for us to chew on. So let's see. What do we want to talk about next? Let me read something here, and I'm going to read it from this book right here. Okay. So this book is called The Ideological Origins of the American Revolution. This is the 50th anniversary edition. It's by Bernard Balin. Because there's a very interesting quotation that he puts here as the epigraph to chapter 1. So he calls chapter 1 the literature of revolution. Now, the reason this book is kind of interesting is because it details a lot of the ideas, the ideologies that fed into this time period. And the way in which this author does that, is he looks at a lot of the literature that was published, primarily pamphlets that were being passed around during this time period. But this is a really interesting quotation that he has here as the epigraph to chapter 1. And this is from a letter from John Adams to Thomas Jefferson in 1815. So, decades later. And John Adams says, "What do we mean by the revolution? The war? That was no part of the revolution. It was only an effect and consequence of it. The revolution was in the minds of the people, and this was effected from 1760 to 1775, in the course of 15 years before a drop of blood was shed at Lexington." Okay, very interesting. So, what he is saying, John Adams to Thomas Jefferson, is he's saying, hey, there's a distinction between the war and the revolution. The war is a consequence of the revolution. It is not the revolution. And if you think of the revolution as the war, that's a reductionist way of looking at the revolution. It was much broader than the war. It preceded the war. So I think it's a really interesting quotation. Again, would we all agree that it was a revolution? Whatever. I'm not going to quibble with John Adams about that. I just think it's interesting how he draws this distinction between the revolution and the war, and he talks about what's going on in the minds of the people before any shots are fired. Now, another thing that's interesting, since we're talking about John Adams, and here he writes that in a letter to Thomas Jefferson. So Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. First of all, these two guys, so John Adams is the second president. He's the president after George Washington. Thomas Jefferson is, of course, the third president. He's president after John Adams. These guys are both two of the five members that are part of the committee that drafts the Declaration of Independence. We tend to think of Thomas Jefferson, but there were four other members of that committee. One of them was Thomas Jefferson. I'm sorry. Obviously, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. So those were the five members. Over time, Thomas Jefferson has largely been credited with writing the Declaration. By the way, there are people that question his authorship. There are some people, and there are plenty of people who think this is a ridiculous idea, but there are people who think that it was written by Thomas Paine. Was it not? I'm not sure. I haven't looked into it in great detail. But those who claim that, and this idea is not new. There were people in, I think as far back as the 19th century, so this idea is like well over a century old, that Thomas Paine may have been the author. Now, who was Thomas Paine? Thomas Paine was an Englishman who did travel to he did move to the States. Then he later would move back to Europe. But he was a pamphleteer, kind of a rabble rouser. And he did invoke a lot of the spirit of revolution in the colonies. And he wrote things such as Common Sense. He wrote The Rights of Man, and he wrote The Age of Reason. Okay, now that's important, right? Now, did he or did he not write the Declaration of Independence? You can look into that yourself, draw your own conclusions. I don't have an opinion one way or the other because I haven't looked into it in great detail. So I'm not here to say one way or the other. But Thomas Paine's influence in kind of this revolutionary spirit that is taking hold in the minds of men at this time was very important. So he was very influential. He knew Benjamin Franklin very well, et cetera. But anyway, back to John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. So one of the interesting points of history is that these guys who were both so instrumental in drafting the Declaration of Independence, they're both early presidents. Interestingly enough, history tells us they both died on July 4th, 1826. Or in other words, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. They both died on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Incidentally, exactly 200 years ago today. So, I don't know, kind of weird. One of those, unique historical points, I guess. I don't really have a point to that other than just, explaining that that's interesting. I'm not suggesting that that's not accurate. I'm not suggesting that there was, I don't know, something more to that than what it is. But if nothing else, it's one of those unique, interesting points of history. Now let's roll the clock back about 5.5 centuries, even a little bit more, and let's talk about the Magna Carta. So, what is the Magna Carta? We're not going to go into great detail. You probably learned about this originally in high school at some point. So go research the Magna Carta on your own. We can't do a deep dive into it here, but this was signed in 1215. Okay, and it was a bunch of it was basically noblemen that forced the king to sign the Magna Carta. And in essence, what was happening was, and this was at Runnymede, what was happening was the Magna Carta enshrined this idea that there were recognized rights that even the king could not necessarily deprive the people of, and that the king was not an absolute monarch. So we have this idea that King George III was this great tyrant, this absolute monarch. I'm not saying there was no tyranny in the British government, but absolute monarch he was not, for some reasons we're about to detail. But the idea that he was not an absolute monarch, I mean, this was something that was well understood and had been understood for centuries. And again, so we're talking about 1776, but more than 5.5 centuries earlier, as far back as the Magna Carta, signed in 1215, was this idea that the king must also abide by the law. So let's not fall for this overly caricatured idea of this king that can just get away with anything. And this, so as we move forward in time, this idea that the ancient rights of Englishmen was something that must be preserved, and even the king must protect those rights and can't just willy-nilly deprive Englishmen of those rights. That was something that was well understood in the British government. Okay, so the Magna Carta, 1215, but if you move forward a couple of centuries, you get to the English Civil War. So the English Civil War is actually a series of civil wars. When are we talking about? We're really talking about the 1640s. And this would also further define the role of Parliament vis-a-vis the monarch. So you got two groups, those that are kind of parliamentarians, and they are entertaining these ideas such as, well, what's the role of Parliament in the government? And if we have a monarchy, what kind of monarchy should we have? Should it be a constitutional monarchy? Should it be an absolute monarchy? Should there be no monarchy? All these questions are being tossed around. Now, those individuals who fought on the side of Parliament, an increased parliamentary role, were known as the Roundheads. This was a derogatory term that was used to describe them because they had pretty closely cropped hair. And those who were the Royalists, or who fought to preserve the role of the king, were known as the Cavaliers. So you got the Roundheads and the Cavaliers. Well, what happens? Oh, by the way, this is where, if you've ever heard this name, Oliver Cromwell, which you've probably at least heard, even if you don't remember what his role was. So he was a leader of the Roundheads, or the Parliamentarians. By the way, they win in the first English Civil War, in the second English Civil War. So the monarch, which was King Charles I, is actually taken into custody and then put to death. And so, again, this puts forth this idea that there is a limitation to what the monarch can do. And therefore, it actually increased the role of Parliament. And in fact, there were even people at this time saying, should we just get rid of the monarchy altogether? Now, let's talk about the Cavaliers for a moment. So the Cavaliers were those who supported the king, who fought on behalf of the king, and who fought to preserve the role of the king. They were on the losing side of the English Civil War. But many of those individuals or their descendants, again, we're talking about the 1640s, would come to the colonies. And this idea of Cavalier culture was very prominent in many of the colonies, primarily Virginia. So this idea of the Cavalier, which in Virginia would become associated with maybe like the landed gentry, or the Virginia gentleman kind of. This culture had come directly from Britain, and were those who, interestingly enough, had supported the role of the king. But Cavalier culture, that's a real thing in Virginia, and even in some parts of the Carolinas. And in fact, the University of Virginia, UVA, if you know anything about UVA sports, of course, their mascot is the Cavalier. Okay, that's not coincidental. Okay, there's a historical and cultural reason as to the selection of the Cavalier as their mascot. Okay, so Cavalier culture, it's a big deal in Virginia. In the 1600s, in the 1700s, many people would say that Washington himself was a product of this Virginia Cavalier culture. Okay, so Magna Carta basically says, hey, the king also has to abide by the law, and that the king is not really an absolute monarch. There are rights of Englishmen that must be protected. The English Civil War sees the rise of the role of Parliament. You see a king that is removed from the throne and put to death. By the way, there were many people who were against the idea that you should kill the king, but many people thought that was too extreme. However, what it at least proved that a king can be removed from the throne, from power. Well, that was in the 1640s. So then what happens later on, a couple of decades later on? So in the late 1680s, you have what is known as the Glorious Revolution, and then the creation of the English Bill of Rights. So this is around 1688, 1689. You have another monarch, James II, who is Catholic. Now, remember, by the late 1600s, for a while now, you've had a lot of division going on in Britain between Catholics and Protestants. And this is not unique to Britain. This is happening all over, Western Europe. However, in Britain, it was particularly acute. Remember, you had King Henry VIII, who wants to get a divorce. The Pope won't let him get a divorce. So, he beheads a couple of his wives. Not all of them, but he beheads a couple of them because he wants a male heir. He can't get a divorce so that he can marry others. There's this whole thing. But amid seeking a male heir and getting rid of some wives and marrying others, what he does is he leaves the Catholic Church, starts a new church with himself as the head of the church. And of course, that would become the Church of England, or the Anglican Church. So a lot of this religious tension is in the backdrop of a lot of this, political frenzy that is going on during this time period in which we're talking about the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution. So anyway, the Glorious Revolution occurs when you have King James II, who is Catholic, and he is forced into exile because some of his own noblemen they actually appeal to a Dutch prince named William of Orange. And they invite him to, by the way, William of Orange, this Dutch prince, is married to Mary. Mary is the daughter of James II, but she's a Protestant. So anyway, William of Orange invades England, and there is basically what we might call a bloodless coup. So there's no real violence. There's no war that erupts. And a lot of the kings, King James II owned noblemen, are actually kind of secretly, they have invited William the Orange to come and remove their king. He is removed, forced into exile, and then his daughter, who's a Protestant, Mary, and her husband, William of Orange, they become joint monarchs, king and queen. This is William and Mary that you've heard about from history. All right, William and Mary, there's the school in Virginia called William and Mary. So anyway, so they jointly rule after that. So there's this bloodless removal of the monarch, which again just further invokes this idea that you can remove a king if he is not properly performing his duties. And in many ways, this is actually a step up from the English Civil War, because there were people who thought that during the English Civil War, the winning side had gone too far by getting rid of the king. People thought that was too extreme. But the Glorious Revolution is a bloodless removal of the king. And also you have this Bill of Rights that is written. So the English Bill of Rights, it kind of establishes this idea that, first of all, you're further enshrining the role of Parliament. There's a further demonstration that a monarch can be removed. There's this idea that you can list grievances against the king, and that also you can seek redress from a king without fear of reprisal. And it also establishes this idea that has been super important since the Magna Carta, that Englishmen have these ancient rights that they cannot be deprived of. Now, later on, when we look at what happens in our own country, particularly as you're writing the Constitution and our own Bill of Rights, we get to due process of law, etc., that must be followed before you can be deprived of your constitutionally protected rights, etc. But you can see where some of these ideas are coming from. Now, let's talk about the Enlightenment for a moment. So one of the writers that was heavily relied upon by the colonists was John Locke. He had written, several treatises. He had this idea of the social contract, these ideas of natural rights, etc., that a lot of the colonists would they found helpful in framing their own ideas as to what Americans should think about rights and how Americans should think about their relationship with the king that, is across the ocean, etc. Now, so what is the Enlightenment? Also known as the Age of Reason. Remember, Thomas Paine had a piece that he had written that was called The Age of Reason. Well, the Enlightenment is not one single unitary group of ideas, okay? There were Enlightenment thinkers and writers in Germany, France, England, Scotland, and some of them were more influential on the American colonists than others. So, for example, Locke was very influential, but so were individuals like Montesquieu and some of the Scottish writers. When I say Scottish writers, we're talking about like David Hume, if you've heard of him, or Adam Smith. A lot of people are familiar with Adam Smith when they study economics or some of the economic ideas that were taking place around this time period in the American colonies. People were relying on some of the writings of Adam Smith. So these are some of the writers that they were European, but they're what they had written, of course, had made it to the Americas, and they were debated here. But also American writers, pamphleteers, etc., would use some of these Enlightenment thinkers to provide support for their own ideas. And what type of ideas? Well, I mentioned some of them, right? Now, some of these thinkers from Europe, from the European Enlightenment, some of them were very influential around the time that the Declaration of Independence was written and signed, and some of them were more influential more than a decade later, when their ideas would be heavily relied upon when it came time to draft the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, etc. That's when people like Montesquieu became very influential, or some of the Scottish Enlightenment thinkers. But John Locke heavily influenced the Declaration of Independence. And again, there's this idea of and there's language that is heavily relied upon by Thomas Jefferson. So when Thomas Jefferson and the rest of the committee is writing the Declaration of Independence, they are using language that had previously been written by other American colonists, such as George Mason, for example. But also those are borrowing ideas or further expounding upon ideas that Enlightenment thinkers had already written about. And of course, one of those was John Locke. So in this book, which I mentioned earlier, the writer Bernard Bailyn does talk a lot about this. And here's another thing that I'll say, and then I'll read some of what Bailyn says. It also wasn't just the Enlightenment thinkers. It was also these ideas that came from ancient Rome. So the Enlightenment, if we try to define what the Enlightenment is, I called it the Age of Reason, which it's also known as, but it's these collection of thoughts that place a focus on things like empiricism, natural right, science, particularly the scientific method. So, observation as it relates to science, kind of getting back to that idea of empiricism, rationalism, and also the increasing role of rational thought and sciences vis-a-vis the role of the church, which would lead to these ideas of distinction between the church and state, and thus perhaps even separation between the church and state. Now, this is all coming out of the Enlightenment, but you could see how that would take hold here. A lot of people use that term separation of church and state. They think that it is in our Constitution. It, of course, is not. That term comes from a letter written by Thomas Jefferson to the Danbury Baptists. It is not something that is in our Constitution, but it is an idea that was kicked around. And Thomas Jefferson does mention that idea in a letter, but it's because it was an idea that was just kind of, in the air at the time. This is kind of a reaction to a lot of these European monarchies, where the king was also the head of the church, in a lot of countries, or where the coronation ceremony for the king was a religious ceremony. So whether that's good, whether that's bad, or whatever, but there was an Enlightenment response to that, which tried to kind of draw a firm line between what is the kind of the province of the church, and then what is the province of science, or even politics in general, etc. So now, why would the colonists care about ancient Rome? Well, they revered ancient Rome, but also saw the warnings from Rome's kind of digression from a republic into an empire. Remember Caesar crossing the Rubicon, et cetera, et cetera. So they saw lessons there that they could draw upon. All right, but let's see what Bernard Bailyn says here. Okay. This is in the preface to his 50th anniversary edition. I'm just going to read a couple things here because it's pretty interesting. The leaders of resistance, as I wrote in the original foreword to the book, were not philosophers or political theorists, but merchants, lawyers, planters, and preachers. Britain's constitution Constitution was famous for its protection of Britain's freedoms. But what was it? It was what was constituted: a loose bundle of statutes, common law, and sanctioned practices without explicit boundaries. In the course of the American struggle with Britain, a new meaning emerged. The term Constitution remained, but was transformed. It came to mean a written, foundational structure of powers and rights superior to and controlling any subsequent enactment. Now, this is important. So the American colonists believed that they had the same ancient rights of Englishmen that those in England had felt they were protecting for centuries, right? This goes all the way back to the Magna Carta. But unlike Britain, where the Constitution is kind of this undefined, unwritten kind of collection of statutes, common law, and sanctioned practices without real boundaries. So there's not one like written document. That's what I mean by unwritten. I mean, obviously the statutes are written, et cetera, but there's no like clearly defined written out constitution. So the colonists took that idea that, hey, there's a collection of laws, rights, et cetera, but they need to be explicitly defined and written out. A constitution must be written. Now we're talking about the Declaration of Independence, but still, that will become important, later on. The dominant cluster of ideas, beliefs, and attitudes that came to light when the Enlightenment platitudes were put aside and one concentrated on what the leaders of the revolutionary movement were actually saying, where their ideas had actually come from, how those ideas had cohered, and how, though derived from a different world, they had articulated circumstances unique to North America. So get rid of all the, Enlightenment platitudes and all the, flowery language. What did the colonists actually care about that they needed to implement in the area where they lived? It became clear that the ideology of the American Revolution was a blend of ideas and beliefs that were extremely radical for the time. Now, maybe we would or would not, quibble with that, but okay. And that are implicitly radical still. In fact, I called the book, when it was first published, The Transforming Radicalism of the American Revolution. That's not the title that he eventually, landed on. Again, the title of the book is The Ideological Origins of the American Revolution. The ideology of the revolution, derived from many sources, was dominated by a peculiar strand of British political thought. It was a cluster of convictions focused on the effort to free the individual from the oppressive misuse of power, from the tyranny of the state. But the spokesman of the revolution, the pamphleteers, essayists, and miscellaneous commentators were not philosophers, and they did not form a detached intelligentsia. They were active politicians, merchants, lawyers, plantation owners, and preachers, and they were not attempting to align their thought with that of major figures in the history of political philosophy, whom modern scholars would declare to have been seminal. Okay, so these are normal guys. Now some of them might have been, somewhat wealthy, but they were normal guys. They were not philosophers, but they were well read. The pamphlets include all sorts of writings, treatises on political theory, essays on history, political arguments, sermons, correspondence, poems, and they display all sorts of literary devices. But for all their variety, they have in common one distinctive characteristic. They are, to an unusual degree, explanatory. They reveal not merely positions taken, but for the reasons why they were taken. They reveal not merely positions taken, but the reasons why positions were taken. They reveal motive and understanding, the assumptions, beliefs, and ideas, the articulated worldview that lay behind the manifest events of the time. So the author Bailyn is saying here, if you look at the essays, the pamphlets, the letters written back and forth, journal entries, whatever, that these colonists were writing, they're not just talking about the positions that they hold, but why they hold them. Assumptions, worldviews, beliefs, ideas, etc. Most commonly, the thought of the revolution has been seen simply as an expression of the natural rights philosophy. The ideas of the social contract, we're kind of talking Locke here, inalienable rights, natural law, and the contractual basis of government. Okay, so that's what he says. This is typically what's been thought of about the revolution. But some have denounced this interpretation as obtuse secularism, and reading the sermons of the time with acute sensitivity, argue that it was only a respect for world opinion that led the founders to put their case in the restricted language of the rational century, and that the success of the revolutionary movement is comprehensible only in terms of the continuing belief in original sin and the need for grace. Okay, so he says there are some who say, hey, you got to look through what the colonists were talking about kind of in Enlightenment terms. And then others are saying, well, they may have written in Enlightenment terms, but you got to really look at the sermons that were being given at the time. You can't understand what the colonists really thought unless you understand the religion that they expressed at the time, though they may have used Enlightenment language to express it. But you can't separate that from their religion. So Bailyn is talking about how there are kind of two different thoughts here. One is looking at things kind of purely through an Enlightenment lens, and the other is, hey, regardless of the way they wrote it and whether or not they may have couched it in Enlightenment terms, you can't separate it from the religion of the time and place. Yet others have described the sermons of the time as a form of deliberate propaganda by which revolutionary ideas were fobbed off on an unsuspecting populace by a black regiment of clergy committed for reasons unexplained to the idea of rebellion. And still others deny the influence of both the Enlightenment theory and theology and view the revolution as no revolution at all, but rather as a conservative movement wrought by practitioners of the common law and devoted to preserving it and the ancient liberties embedded in it intact. So this is really interesting because he's saying, hey, radical ideas maybe that are coming from the Enlightenment. Some people view it that way, but others view it as religious. And then another group says, well, and the religious group may say, hey, the colonists had to write it in Enlightenment language, but it was really a religious revolution. And then others say, no, they wrote it in religious terms, maybe, or spoke about it in religious terms, but that's not really, what it was. That's just the way that they had to appeal to the people so that they would support it. So they're kind of all these different ideas. And then the author Bailyn says, some say it had nothing to do with Enlightenment radicalism or with religion, but was actually a conservative movement and really was not that revolutionary at all, and was all about protecting these ancient customs, kind of these ancient rights of Englishmen. So which of these is correct? I mean, is it some blend of all that? People are going to have different opinions on that. The pamphlets do reveal the influence of Enlightenment thought, and they do show the effective force of certain religious ideas, of the common law, and also of classic literature. But they reveal most significantly the close integration of these elements in a pattern of, to me at least, surprising design. Surprising because of the prominence in it of still another tradition interwoven with, yet still distinct from, these more familiar strands of thought. This distinctive influence had been transmitted most directly to the colonists by a group of early 18th century radical publicists and opposition politicians in England who carried forward into the 18th century and applied to the politics of the age of Walpole the peculiar strain of anti-authoritarianism bred in the upheaval of the English Civil War. Now, we just talked about the English Civil War. The more I read, the less useful it seemed to me was the whole idea of propaganda in its modern meaning when applied to the writings of the American Revolution, a view that I hope to develop at length on another occasion. In the end, I was convinced that the fear of a comprehensive conspiracy against liberty throughout the English-speaking world, a conspiracy believed to have been nourished in corruption, and of which it was felt oppression in America was only the most immediately visible part, lay at the heart of the revolutionary movement. Okay, so like he's talking about the idea that there were those who believed that, hey, there's this conspiracy against liberty, all over, and we have to stop this here in the Americas, or it'll take hold, everywhere. Just a couple more things I'm going to read from here. What is basically important in the Americans' reading of the ancients is the high selectivity of their real interests and the limitation of the range of their effective knowledge. For though the colonists drew their citations from all portions of the literature of the ancient world, their detailed knowledge and engaged interest covered only one era and one small group of writers. What gripped their minds, what they knew in detail, and what formed their view of the whole of the ancient world was the political history of Rome, from the conquests in the East and the civil wars in the early first century to the establishment of the empire on the ruins of the Republic at the end of the 2nd century AD. So they were very concerned with the lessons that could be drawn from Rome more than anywhere else in the ancient world. I'm skipping a lot here, just reading some excerpts here. Britain, it would soon become clear, was to America what Caesar was to Rome. Let me read that again. Britain, it would soon become clear, was to America what Caesar was to Rome. Their influence remains and is profusely illustrated in the political literature. It is not simply that the great virtuosi of the American Enlightenment, Franklin, Adams, Jefferson, cited the classic Enlightenment texts and fought for the legal recognition of natural rights and for the elimination of institutions and practices associated with the ancien regime, the ancient regime. That's a French term, the old regime. This would be kind of what the Enlightenment was a response to, or in some ways resistant to, the old regime. They did so, but they were not alone. The ideas and writings of the leading secular thinkers of the European Enlightenment, reformers and social critics like Voltaire, Rousseau, Beccaria, as well as conservative analysts like Montesquieu, were quoted everywhere in the colonies by everyone who claimed a broad awareness. In pamphlet after pamphlet, the American writers cited Locke on natural rights and on the social and governmental contract, Montesquieu and later Delhomme on the character of British liberty and on the institutional requirements for its attainment, Voltaire on the evils of clerical oppression, Beccaria on the reform of criminal law, Grotius, Pufendorf, Burlamaqui, and Vattel on the laws of nature and of nations and on the principles of civil government. So they read a lot, and there were different thinkers that influence certain ideas that they would put into practice in the American. Locke is cited often with precision on points of political theory, but at other times he is referred to in the most offhand way, as if he could be relied on to support anything the writers happen to be arguing. Now, this is kind of funny, but I'm glad that he puts that in there. What's he saying? He's saying they would cite Locke all over the place. And sometimes when they would cite him, they had an accurate understanding of what he was saying and the way they were applying it to the argument they were making, right? But other times, they would just appeal to Locke as if Locke was offering some sort of evidentiary support for whatever they were arguing, and the application may or may not have been truly apt. Now, we see this all the time today, where people will appeal to someone they've never really read, or that they don't really understand, or they are applying an idea that someone has written, some esteemed writer or thinker, historically perhaps, and they're trying to use that to bolster an argument that they're making, but they're not really making a solid connection. People do that all the time. And in the colonist era, despite the fact that many of them were very well read, of course, those things still happened, right? Everywhere, whatever his position on independence or his judgment of Parliament's actions, cited them as authoritative. Almost no one, Whig or Tory, disputed them or introduced them with apology. Writers the colonists took to be opponents of Enlightenment rationalism, primarily Hobbes, Filmer, Sibthorpe, Mandeville, and Manwaring, were denounced as frequently by loyalists as by patriots, but almost never before 1776 were Locke, Montesquieu, Vattel, Beccaria, Burlamaqui, Voltaire, or even Rousseau. Now, this is interesting. So, whether you were for or against independence, you tended to use the Enlightenment thinkers to bolster your ideas, and whether you were for or against independence, you tended to denounce the anti-Enlightenment thinkers. So Enlightenment thinkers were used by kind of both sides of the independence movement here in the Americas for support. Referred to on all sides by writers of all political viewpoints in the colonies, the major figures of the European Enlightenment and many of the lesser contributed substantially to the thought of the Americans. But except for Locke's, their influence, though more decisive than that of the authors of classical antiquity, was neither clearly dominant nor wholly determinative. So they really, really looked at Locke. The common law was manifestly influential in shaping the awareness of the revolutionary generation. Let's see if there's anything else we really want to read from here, and then we'll move on. The colonists had no doubt about what power was and about its central dynamic role in any political system. Power to them meant the dominion of some men over others, the human control of human life, ultimately force, compulsion. So just, understanding power and what it is that they are, concerned about in their writings. All right, this is a book called The Constitutional Origins of the American Revolution by Jack P. Green, which is interesting when you look at the revolution as kind of a constitutional conflict, right? So this is from his preface. We're not going to read nearly as much in this one. Briefly put, the argument I talked about the revolution had two main points. The first was that the new British taxation and coercive measures after 1748, some emanating from the Crown and some from Parliament, represented a formidable challenge both to the customary constitutions that the colonies severally had been working out for themselves over the previous century or longer, and to the thoroughly English rights and principles that those constitutions had been constructed to preserve. The second was that the colonial response to that challenge, responses that drew heavily on the colonists' own customary constitutions, articulated a conception of the imperial constitution that diverged sharply from the one held at the imperial center, and that this disagreement over the nature of the imperial constitution had an important causal bearing on the American Revolution, so a constitutional conflict. Now, the reason we're going to read this is because he makes a reference to Bernard Bailyn, the book we were just reading in. When in the late 1960s, Bernard Bailyn and others did explore those traditions and assumptions in depth, and by assumptions, he's talking about like the constitutional traditions, they assigned little positive weight to the specifically constitutional dimensions of the conflict. In Bailyn's ideological interpretation of the revolution, neither the early modern English jurisprudential tradition of political writing nor the related liberal and Whig traditions that had been largely constructed on that jurisprudential tradition received much emphasis. especially not in comparison with the fears of corruption and ministerial power that for Balin principally informed colonial protests of the pre-revolutionary era. Okay, what is he saying? He is saying that Balin, who wrote the book, The Ideological Origins of the American Revolution, that we were just reading in, focuses, as his title says, on the ideologies of the revolution as they were written by the colonists themselves. But according to Jack P. Green, the author of this book, he doesn't focus so much on the constitutional traditions. Now, remember, we think when we hear the word Constitution, we think of the U.S. Constitution that, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, was written in 1787, ratified in 1788, fully in effect in 1789. But that was our second Constitution. The first was the Articles of Confederation. That was a Constitution. But you had many constitutions in the colonies that preceded those, because the colonies had their own constitutions. So this idea of constitutions was not new to the colonists. And that the constitutions preserved rights, and that there were political traditions that had been long held and long believed that were enshrined in those constitutions. Okay, so let's read one more thing. The revolution that occurred in North America during the last quarter of the 18th century was the unintended consequence of a dispute about law. During the dozen years between 1764 and 1776, Britons on both sides of the Atlantic engaged in an elaborate debate over the source and character of law within the larger British Empire. Whether the king and parliament, the ultimate source of statute law in Great Britain, could legislate for British colonies overseas was the ostensible question in dispute. But many other related and even deeper legal issues involving the nature of the constitution of the empire emerged from and were thoroughly canvassed during the debate. On neither side of the Atlantic was opinion monolithic, but two sides, one representing the dominant opinion in metropolitan Britain and the other the principal view in the colonies, rapidly took shape. The failure to reconcile these positions led in 1775 to open warfare, and in 1776 to the decision of 13 of Britain's more than 30 American colonies to declare their independence and form an American Union. The nature and shifting character of this dispute can only be understood by placing it in the larger temporal process of imperial legal and constitutional thought and practice over the previous century and a half. So, just some things to think about. Now, I mean, do we have to say whether or not Green is correct about what Balin missed or whatever? Draw your own conclusions. Look into this yourself. I think both of them make some great points, because I do think that as Americans, it's important for us to understand what were the colonists writing about, and where did they get their ideas, and what did they think about those ideas, and how did they view the application of European ideas to their situation in North America, and what was their view of jurisprudence and law and the role of the king vis-a-vis the colonies, and their relationship to the king, their relationship to Parliament, their relationship to the royal governors, self-determinism, all of these ideas, and he mentioned something very important in what we just read, where he says on neither side of the Atlantic was there a, monolithic thought. And that's important, because the founding fathers did not always agree upon themselves. And also there were divisions about whether or not independence was a good idea, whether it made sense legally, whether it made sense philosophically, whether it was practical, whether it was possible, whether it was too dangerous or necessary, right? There were a lot of these valid questions that were being asked. Okay, another thing, we're not going to read any of this, but it must be mentioned. Many of you have probably heard about William Blackstone, who wrote 4 volumes, and this work was called Commentaries on the Laws of England. It was written in 1765, I believe. I think that's correct. And it was well known by the colonists. And so the reason people talk about Blackstone today is because, and this is true, that if you want to know the way in which terms were understood legally during the founding period, then you should familiarize yourself with the way that William Blackstone used those terms, and that is true. And there are other references as well, but Blackstone is well known. So the colonists were very familiar with Blackstone's commentaries, and therefore, as they understood Blackstone's commentaries, they understood the way in which his understanding of British laws would or would not apply generally, Now, let's talk about some other historic precedents, and we'll move through these quickly. So what was the Albany Plan? So the Albany Plan, and this precedes the Declaration of Independence by 20 years. In fact, I believe it dates back to 1754, but this was a plan that had been proposed by Benjamin Franklin for independence. And he couldn't get it off the ground. He couldn't get it off the ground because the various colonies were just too provincial in their thinking, or too sectional, which means the colonies cared first and foremost about their specific colony or about their little region of colonies. The northeastern colonies about the northeastern colonies, the southern colonies. There was just too much provincialism and too much sectionalism and not enough desire for unity against the British government. Now, things would change. So what happens kind of between that time period? Well, interestingly enough, you have the French and Indian War. Now, the French and Indian War is very interesting because, of course, why do we call it the French and Indian War? Well, we call it the French and Indian War because we use the British name for it, because at that time, of course, the American colonists were British. They were fighting with the British. So George Washington, as a soldier, was fighting, on the side of the British against the French and Indians. Hence the name of the war. And in fact, some would say he actually kind of started it with some actions that he engaged in as a very young man. You can go look that up. George Washington, I'm talking about. And the French and Indian War occurs. It's a long war, drains a lot of British resources. It was fought in the Americas. So, back in London, the thought is we're going to have to raise taxes, and we're going to have to tax the colonists because they were the primary beneficiaries of the war. Like, they're the ones that were protected by us, engaging in this war against the French and the Indians. Now, is that right? Is that wrong? Were the taxes, too high? Were those taxes really justified? Whatever. We could debate that all day long. But that was the thinking in London, supposedly, as to why some of these taxes had to be increased. Obviously, the colonists didn't like these taxes, and there are all types of taxes. I mean, you probably remember back from history class, you remember the taxes on tea or the Stamp Act. There's the Boston Tea Party that occurs. All of this precedes the Revolutionary War. There's the Townshend Acts. So tension is happening, or tension is rising. It's increasing between the colonists and London. Well, then what happens, right? So we already know about the events of April 19th at Lexington and Concord. The night prior to that, so the night of 1819 April 1775, Paul Revere has his ride. He would not have yelled out to everyone the British are coming, because he was British. That's not what he would have said. He might have said maybe the redcoats are coming or whatever, but not the British. Remember, they were British. They believed in the ancient rights of Englishmen. And at that time, there is no Declaration of Independence yet. Okay, that is April 19th, 1775. So Paul Revere has his ride. He's supposedly warning people that the army is coming, but yeah, he would not have said the British are coming, because that term would not have made sense, because they were all British, right? So maybe he said the redcoats are coming, but anyway, the next day is the skirmish at Lexington and Concord, right? That's April 19th, 1775. Well, then what happens? Okay, so fast forward a year. I made a video about Paul Revere's ride, but I also made a video about what's called the Meck Deck, the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence. This document that many people think is not authentic today, but it was historically significant at the time and has remained culturally significant in North Carolina. And it was supposedly written on May 20th, 1775. And again, the authenticity is disputed nowadays. But that date, May 20th, 1775, is one of the two dates that is featured on the North Carolina state flag. Okay, so regardless of whether or not that document was authentic, a very short time later, on May 31st, 1775, so a week and a half later, the Mecklenburg Resolves were written. And, I talked about this in a video. And then a year later, almost a year later, the Halifax Resolves were this call for independence that were signed in North Carolina on April 12th, 1776. That is the other date that is featured prominently on the North Carolina state flag. So May 20th, 1775, the date of the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence, and April 12th, 1776, the Halifax Resolves. But the Halifax Resolves do basically call for independence, and they precede July 4th by almost 3 months. That's why you will see in North Carolina, if you have a North Carolina license tag, you will, some of them will say on them, First in Freedom. Now, a lot of them say First in Flight because of the Wright brothers, Kitty Hawk. But a lot of them will say First in Freedom. And it is referring to the Halifax Resolves and even some of these other documents. So there were calls for independence before we get to July 4th, 1776. Now, I already talked about the committee of Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, John Adams, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston that were convened specifically to write this. Did Thomas Paine actually write it? Who knows? Go research that yourself, draw your own conclusions. But not everybody in the American colonies was in favor of independence. Now, when we think about the founding period, we often think about the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Now, that's more the split about whether to oppose ratification of the Constitution or not. That's later. That's more than a decade later. The split between independents is really the Whigs versus the Tories. Now, those two terms, they're terms that were used in Britain, and they were kind of carried over to the American colonists, and they have their own meanings as to what they mean in Britain. But I'll kind of explain what they meant here in this situation in the debate over independence in this time period. But interestingly enough, Whigs and Tories, so both terms are derogatory. So it's kind of one of these things where, like, the term, this happens a lot, the term originates as a derogatory term, but then it ends up being embraced by the people it's supposed to describe, and they just kind of take it on. But Whigs and Tories is basically like saying thieves and robbers. That's really kind of what the terms actually mean, thieves and robbers, which is kind of, anyway, it's kind of funny, right? So Whigs and Tories. So Whigs, generally speaking, now in Britain, there would have been a much more complex definition as to what these parties would mean. But generally speaking, in the colonies during this time period, a Whig is someone who favored independence. A Tory is someone who did not favor independence. Now, sometimes Whigs were called patriots, though some would say, well, they're not exact synonyms. And we don't have to draw a line super, it doesn't have to be like a super clear line on where we make this distinction. But some would say a patriot is not just necessarily any Whig, but it is specifically someone who actively supports independence. Not just that they're in favor of it, but they actively support it either by fighting or some other direct support, like financial support, or pamphleteering in support of independence. That those would be the patriots. Now, patriot is an interesting term in this regard because even in Britain, the term patriot in those days was used a little bit differently than we would use it. For us, we look back on it and we say, yeah, a patriot is somebody who was fighting for independence. That makes sense. But in Britain, when the term patriot was used, it could mean someone who, loves their country, but sometimes it would even be used to describe someone who potentially was like a dangerous rebel or somebody who wanted to, challenge the monarchy or potentially even overthrow the government. That's generally not the way we would use that term today, but you can see how patriot, the term, had some unique connotations during that time period, and could or could not be a term that would be used, reverentially, right? Okay, what else? Tories. So Tories were those who, generally speaking, did not support independence. Now, because we might have a tendency to look back on this kind of in an unsophisticated way and say, "Oh man, what cowards!" But let's give them their due. Were there legitimate questions other than just being afraid to support independence? What might be some legitimate reasons to at least have some concerns, whether we agree or disagree? But did they have some legitimate concerns? Well, some of them believed that the patriots were exaggerating their grievances with the king. Okay, maybe we agree or disagree, but that was a thought. And some thought this doesn't have to, like independence is too extreme a step. We can list our grievances, we can seek redress from the king, but independence is too far. Others thought, it's not just unnecessary, but it's also dangerous. This could lead to violence, and there's no way we can win. And then what happens? It's not just that if you participated in it, you might be in trouble, but there could be harsh responses on all the colonies. We could all suffer because of this, and it could really decrease our ability to, make a livelihood. What if there are increased security measures? What if the taxes are increased? What if more of our rights are infringed, etc.? And then some of the Tories were businessmen, and they were trading with Britain, with Britain on the other side of the ocean, and they felt that their trade would be affected if they went to war. Now, is that a legitimate concern or not? You can you can make your own decision there. But I'm just saying these were some of the ideas that were in the heads of the Tories. Now, another term for Tory was loyalist. Okay, as in they were loyal to the government, and they saw the patriots as disloyal to their own government. And some of these loyalists would fight alongside the British. So there were skirmishes or battles between Whigs and Whigs and or patriots and loyalists. Where loyalists were basically fighting against the patriots. So it was very complex. And we look back on it and we tend to paint with a broad brush, but I mean, there may have been some legitimate concerns with some of these people who were saying, this is too extreme a step. Now, does that mean they were right? Does that mean that they were wrong? I'm not necessarily saying one way or the other. I'm just saying they may have had some legitimate questions. As I said at the beginning of this video, I'm a proud American. I am. I think that the revolution accomplished some good things. And I like studying this time period. I think the war for independence is fascinating in some ways to study. Now, I said before, I do think there are some kind of hidden machinations in the shadows that we should understand. But yeah, I'm not saying we should reunite with Britain or something ridiculous like that. But it doesn't mean that all Tory concerns were totally unfounded. That's going too far. Okay, now here's another point. The revolution was not just against the king as the head of state, but also as the head of the church. That's why in the U.S. we used to not, you hear it more now, but you used to not hear the term Anglicanism or the Anglican Church as much to refer to the church here. It was the Episcopalian Church. The Anglican Church referred to the church in England, because it is the Church of England. And this is because, a lot of colonists were Anglicans. But once you fight a war and you separate from Britain, well, the king is no longer your head of state. And you don't, and that's kind of weird if he's no longer your head of state, but he's somehow still the head of the church. And so they had to kind of separate themselves from the Anglican Church. And that's where kind of Episcopalianism came in. Though nowadays you do kind of hear, like I hear Americans refer to themselves as Anglicans, but I think it's because there's, 2.5 centuries later, we don't have the same animosity towards Britain that we had back then. Okay. The last thing that we're going to do in this video, because I know I've been like droning on here and rambling for a while now, is we are going to look at a little bit of the text of the document itself. Okay. All right, you can tell it's getting darker outside, darker in here. I don't have the best lighting situation in here. So anyway, let's go ahead and bring up the text. Now, I have I have a little booklet here, a little booklet that contains the Declaration and the Constitution, and it has a basically an introduction as well by Pauline Maier. Now, Pauline Maier is kind of an interesting author. She has a book that is called American Scripture, and she's kind of well known for this term. I have not read through the whole book. I have read parts of it. It's kind of interesting. I've heard a lot about it. And there are differing ideas on whether or not, I grew up hearing that term, hearing the term Scripture used to describe things like the Declaration, the Constitution, or even things like, the Gettysburg Address. I used to hear that a lot when I was growing up. I don't particularly like those terms. I do think that's a misuse of the term Scripture. I get it. I understand it. But I think you are attributing a sacred status to texts that don't quite merit it. You can think that the Declaration of Independence is very important without necessarily referring to it by a term that implies some sort of sacrality to it. So that's kind of where I think I land on that. Is there, I don't know, is it maybe sacred in like a civic sense? Okay, but then does the term sacred, does it really apply? And so, because I feel like when you use the term Scripture, you're kind of implying sacred. So anyway, there are many people, not just Pauline Maier, there are many people who have used the term Scripture to refer to the Declaration and or the Constitution. I get it. I understand it. I'm not necessarily a fan of that, though. I think that just goes too far. Anyway, that's my opinion. Maybe you have a slightly different one. Okay. Now, this is very short. You should read this today as a good homework assignment. It's very short. Now, I could read it in that little book, but I figured I'd just pull it up where we can look at it together. And this is, from an official source. It's from the National Archives. So it's very easy to find. Just go to your search engine and just put in Declaration of Independence, and this will be one of the first entries that comes up. So let's just read just a little bit of it. But like I said, the whole thing is very short. You can read it easily in just a couple of minutes. So in Congress, July 4th, 1776. Let's start with the first paragraph. Sometimes this first paragraph is omitted. I don't like that. Anyway, okay. The unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America, comma. Let's stop there. You can see that that's, at least here on this source in the National Archives, that is written in bold. So let's look at this. 13 United States of America. So this is written by a body of 13 states. And that is important because we must remember that, yeah, we live in a federal republic as created by our Constitution. Now, this precedes the Constitution, but this is an act not of one unitary group. It is an act of 13 distinct states that are acting together, but they are acting each in their independent sovereign status as distinct sovereign states. It is super important that we understand that. Okay. All right. Also, you can see there that the U in United is written as a lowercase u. That is significant. That's the way that United States used to be written. Historically, the other thing is that United States, historically speaking, used to be spoken of in the plural, and we have lost that over time. So, for example, nowadays you would say the United States has the largest national economy in the world. But historically speaking, during this time period, you would say the United States have, not the United States has. You would say the United States are, not the United States is, like we would tend to say today. Today, we would say the United States is a large country geographically or whatever, We lost that as the role of the states relative to the general government, the national government or the federal government has kind of been reduced over time. I think that's bad. I think that's dangerous. And I think that unfortunately the states have been complicit in the reduction of their sovereignty vis-a-vis the central government, as much as the federal government has been guilty in kind of aggrandizing unto itself more power. All right, let's keep going. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separation and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. Now, so laws of nature, so we talked about natural rights. A huge topic during this time period was what was called natural law. One of the tenets of natural law, this becomes very important, a decade down the road when they're framing the Constitution, is that the government does not give you your rights. Your rights exist independently of the government. And this was not new. I mean, there were Englishmen who would say that the ancient rights of Englishmen are outside of the scope of the king, that the king does not grant you your rights. You do not exist at the will and the pleasure of the king. So here there's kind of this mention of natural law and nature's God. Now, some people, there are differing ideas on what nature's God means. Some people think that this is clearly a reference to deity, which I obviously would agree with. But is it a reference to Christ? And a lot of people have differing opinions on that. Is this a deistic reference? Is it a reference to Christ? Is it just a reference to kind of, God in general? Whatever. There are a lot of differing opinions on that. Okay. And then kind of the last clause here of this first paragraph is that the purpose of this Declaration of Independence is to explain why the colonists are dissolving the political band that connect them with Britain. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. We're going to stop right there. Now, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So the ideas of life, liberty, and property had been around for a while. So that's not new, but you can see some of this Enlightenment language is being borrowed from and being used here with some changes, some adaptations, such as the pursuit of happiness, right? You also see here this idea that all men are created equal. Now, this, of course, has caused a lot of conflict over the decades and centuries, because what about slavery, etc.? There were debates about whether or not the kind of anti-slavery clauses should be put into the Declaration of Independence. They weren't, those were not included. So, is this one of those areas where America is somewhat of a land of contradiction in some ways? Maybe we could say so, right? They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Okay. So again, a reference to deity. Now, is that Christ? I mean, if you're a Christian, you believe that Christ is the Creator. Okay. Does that necessarily mean that this is a Christian reference? Again, you're going to get differing ideas on this. But regardless, there's this idea that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. So your rights come from God. They do not come from the government. Let's keep reading. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Okay, I'm going to read part of that again. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter, to abolish it, and to institute new government. So again, that is language that is not in the Constitution. That's in the Declaration of Independence. It would not make sense to be in the Constitution. The Constitution was the new form of government. Why would it have language talking about abolishing the government? What the Constitution does have is a system of amending it, okay? But the talk about abolishing government or altering it is language that comes from the Declaration of Independence. It is what we just read. Now, that's a pretty bold claim, okay? And on its surface, maybe it appears radical. But remember, these are people who understood the Magna Carta. They understood the English Civil Wars. They understood the Glorious Revolution and the English Bill of Rights. Okay, let's keep going. Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. And accordingly, all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. So, hey, listen, just because you think that you're we don't take this decision lightly, okay? It's not that we think there's been some light or rather innocuous slight that has been committed against us, okay? We don't believe that that the decision to alter or abolish a government is one that should be taken lightly. Okay, that's kind of what it's saying. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. It's a big deal to say that a government should be altered or abolished. That's a big deal. Okay, that's what it's basically saying. When a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. So if there is a long train of abuses and usurpations, then you have not just a right, but a duty to throw off such government. So the colonists are saying it's not only our right to alter or abolish the government, we have a duty to do so. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. Okay, we have suffered long enough. The King of Great Britain has a history of repeated injuries towards us, and he is establishing an absolute tyranny over us. And to show that, here is a list of these long train of this long train of abuses. Okay, so we're not going to read through these. By all means, go and read through them. You know, they're listed out. Some people would say that these are exaggerated. Some would even go so far as to say the Declaration of Independence is almost it's meant kind of as a rabble-rousing document. Some would even use the word propaganda, maybe not necessarily in that to convey that it's like fake or fraudulent or whatever, but just to convey that it is written in a way that is meant to be provocative, and it is written in language that is not so much written for the king as much as it is written for the American public. And that's important to understand. Who's your audience here? Okay, because Americans are going to read this too. And in fact, shortly after this was written and it was signed, copies were given to George Washington. Remember, the war had already been going on for a year, and George Washington actually had it read aloud, to the troops. Okay. Now, I'm not saying I call it propaganda. I'm not saying that. I'm saying some people use that term. I think that's a pretty strong description of it. But are some things potentially embellished or written in a way that is perhaps intentionally inflammatory? I mean, I think you can maybe say that. Okay. So we'll read the last part here. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. Okay? A tyrant is unfit to rule free people. That's what they're saying. Hey, listen. We have sought redress for our grievances, and what has happened, just more injuries against us. Nor have we been wanting in attentions to our British brethren. We have warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislature to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our immigration and settlement here. We have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity, and we have conjured them by the ties of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. They too have been deaf to the voice of justice and of consanguinity. We must therefore acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation and hold them, as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace, friends. Okay, now this is interesting because this is written to, our British brethren. We have tried to let them know what's happening with their government, but they too have been deaf to the voice of justice and consanguinity. That consanguinity is the term would mean like with blood. So we're brethren, like we're the same blood, you know? Yeah, we have the same blood. We're the same people. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress, assembled, appealing to the supreme judge of the world, so another reference to deity, for the rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And for the support of declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Okay. And you can see here the signatories, on the actual document, as everyone knows, John Hancock signed his name really large. So, anyway, so what's this is really important, this last paragraph here, because this is the one where they state these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. They go one step further, and they say, we are free and independent states. And yes, we can levy war. We can conclude peace. We can contract alliances, establish commerce. We can do anything that a state can do. Now that's important, because what they're saying is like, hey, if there's going to be a war, like we have the right to wage war. We also have the right to end war, to sign a treaty, conclude peace. So anyway, we'll kind of stop the share right there. I didn't want to read all of it, but I wanted to read some of the more salient parts. I didn't necessarily want to go through the long train of abuses, because you can read that on your own. Just understand that those are there. But like I said, the whole document is pretty short. It can be read in a very short period of time. And if I were to give a couple of homework assignments, like good July 4th homework assignments, here's what I would say. Read the Declaration of Independence and read your state constitution. We don't do enough of that. I mentioned a few minutes ago when we first started reading the opening paragraph of the Declaration that the Declaration was a declaration not of one unitary block of people, but of 13 states. They were declaring themselves to be free and independent states, and that's important. It's important that they saw themselves as states, but it's also important that they saw themselves as 13 states as opposed to one, unitary republic. You can also see a lot of language in that last paragraph is language that was taken directly from Richard Henry Lee's resolution that had been signed on July 2nd. Remember, Richard Henry Lee, I said it at the very beginning of tonight's video, he had said that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. So you can see that language very closely used in that closing paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. So let me just sum up and end here with a couple of points. Proud American here. I think we have a great nation. I think we have a lot to be proud of as Americans. We have a lot in our history to look back on and be happy about. But that doesn't mean that we have to be, we don't have to have an all or nothing attitude when it comes to looking at our country and what our country is, what our country does, what our country represents, right? It doesn't have to be all or nothing. You don't have to be a fan of everything that our country has done or be a fan of nothing that the country has done. There's a lot of room there in the middle to say, hey, our country's done a lot right. Our country stands for a lot that is right and true and good. And our country has also been on the wrong side of history, plenty of times. And sometimes it's because our government has engaged in activities that are perhaps openly defiant to what we as a country believe that we stand for. So this is important. It's important for us to have clear in our heads what we are as a country, who we are, what we stand for. And in order for us to know what we stand for and kind of where we're headed in the future, because I think the future looks bleak, if I'm being honest, it's important for us to know where we came from. And again, I'm going to talk about this in much greater detail in a different video. But yes, I do think that the United States is a Christian nation. But I also think that that is an oversimplification. Yes, I think it's also a Freemasonic nation. Yeah, I think it's a deistic nation. So how can it be all of that? I mean, great question. It is this. There is just this syncretic nature to America, which is kind of why I called it, a land of contradictions in some ways. But we'll talk more about that at a later time. So happy 4th of July. I know it's kind of late. I would have liked to have gotten this video out sooner, but I just had a lot going on, so I wasn't able to. But I hope you enjoy your 4th. You should enjoy your 4th, but you also should know what the 4th of July is about. And this isn't just any 4th of July. We're celebrating 250 years, a quarter of a millennium. That's a long time, but at the same time, it's not a long time. We don't know what the future holds for our country. There have been a lot of attacks on what it means to be an American. And I think we need to define what it means to be an American, what it means for America as a country, what it means for each of our individual states within America. And we need to have that clear in our minds, because if we don't, we will continue to be attacked. Our idea of what America is and what we are as Americans will continue to be attacked. And we are already suffering a pretty major identity crisis as it is. So read the Declaration of Independence, read your state constitution. Those are great July 4th, homework assignments that I think anyone can do. So, all right. Hey, thanks everyone. Like I said, happy July 4th. And I hope you are finding ways to engage in fun activities to celebrate, but also that you are engaged in thought and reflection on what the day represents as well. Have a good one. See you next time.